First, we'd like to talk about Singapore-Japan bilateral relations. I understand you started working for the government, exiting the military in 1984, under your father, of course. And your job was Ministry of Trade and Industry in those days. And I believe you had a lot of interaction with Japanese businesses and Japanese government. Can you share a little bit of your experiences in those days, how you were looking at Japanese businesses, Japanese companies, and how you were trying to build a relationship, private sector relationship, to improve Singaporean economy?
Well, when I went to the Ministry of Trade and Industry after I entered politics, 1984, 1985, one of the first things I learned was that the Japanese companies were a very major source of investments in Singapore, important companies here. And this had been so since the early days of our independence. We became independent in 1966. IHI set up a shipyard here, together with Sembawang. It became Jurong Shipyard. And today, Jurong Shipyard operates a huge mega yard at Tuas. It's completely transformed from what it started off, but it's still there. Later on in the 1970s, other important projects came in. Matsushita Electric, for example, had many entities in Singapore, many different factories. I visited several of them, including the compressor factory in Chiez. And at that time, they had made several 100 million refrigerator and air conditioner compressors, used all over the world. By the time they finished, I think they had made more than 1 billion compressors in Singapore. And today, the global headquarters for the compressor part of, now not Matsushita, but Panasonic's operations, still in Singapore. Seiko came to Singapore. I think the CEO was Mr. Hara. I don't remember him, but my father knew him well. And he set up a watch factory in Singapore because he could find workers here who were meticulous, precise, and could meet the high standards which Seiko demanded. And today, Seiko still no longer makes those watches here, but they have the R&D center here. Then later, this was all in the 1970s. Then in the 1980s, we had Sumitomo Chemical. And they set up a petrochemical plant here, PCS, Petrochemical Corporation of Singapore. And Mr. Hasegawa, he was the CEO, and I met him. They set up the plant. It was a very major project for Singapore because from refining petroleum products, we went downstream into petrochemical products. And they set up on Jurong. In those days, it was Air Merbau or Air Cawan. There's one of the islands in Jurong. Now we have joined all the islands together. It's become Jurong Island. And the plant is still there. And Sumitomo was here with their regional headquarters. So I learned how important Japanese investments were to Singapore and how over the years they evolved and grew and adapted themselves to the more advanced conditions in our economy and the different demands in the world, and still remain here today.
Did you set any conditions when you invited Japanese companies or Japanese businesses into Singapore, like technology transfer or training? I don't think we had technology transfer requirements. Basically, we wanted them to come, invest, and create good jobs. And we hoped that in the process they would train their people and our people would gain skills which would be valuable, which was so. And because we took this attitude, we were able to get Japanese companies come and invest in Singapore readily, and then they were profitable, and then more Japanese companies came. After I went into MTI, the year I went in, we ran into a severe recession, 1985. Yes. Very severe recession. We took very drastic measures. Our GDP went down, became negative for the first time ever. Our investments. What was your analysis back then? What was the cause of the recession?
We felt that we had allowed our costs to go out of line. We had allowed wages to rise too fast. And then it was all right when the conditions were favorable, but in 1985, there was a downturn in all of the newly industrializing economies, in Japan, in Korea, in Taiwan, Hong Kong. But we felt it most severely because our costs had been very far out of line. So we had to make a very drastic correction.
So your wages went up before your industry made transformation necessary?
In fact, as a matter of policy, had encouraged the wages to go up in order to encourage the industries to transform themselves as an incentive. But we went too far. So we went into the recession, we made a correction, we cut CPF drastically, wage costs came back down, and one of the first things I did after we made this package of measures was to go to Japan to do investment promotion.
What was your selling point compared to other countries?
My selling point is that in a recession, we can work with the unions to cut costs.
Oh, okay.
And so you can have confidence in us, come and invest in Singapore. And I was very happy we did have good investments come out of that trip.
And at that time, was your education system as good as it is now? I mean, in other words, your labor force had a decent quality back then.
Not as well educated as now, and the education system not as comprehensive and as targeted as it is now. But our workers were very dedicated and hardworking, and they were very cohesive. They worked together with the union leaders, and the union leaders worked together with the government and the employers. And so the employers could rely on them. Even then, they were the best workforce in the world, according to the Berry survey. And we have maintained that position since then. But of course, since then, the education level, the skills level has gone up enormously, and the continuing training of the workers has also gone up a lot. Not as much as we need to, but we are doing much more now than before.
But at least in the Southeast Asian countries, among countries here, probably you had already an advantage.
Yes, but we are now, therefore, in a different market segment and competing with other countries. The Chinese technical levels and skill levels are very high, and their costs are lower than ours. And the developed countries, now with flexible manufacturing, with 3D printing, and also with deglobalization tendencies, there's more incentive for companies to stay in the developed countries and manufacture there. To some extent in Japan, but certainly also in America and in Europe. And we have to compete with them and their skill levels and their advantage of having the market there and not having that international transportation and that transnational barrier. So we have to be better.
Yes. And actually, there's a proof that Singapore is keep getting better, which was announced this week by the World Economic Forum. I'd like to congratulate you on ranking the first, number one in the world in terms of competitiveness.
Thank you very much. We try to stay there. But the competition is very fierce, and sometimes we are number one, sometimes we are number two, but we try to stay somewhere near there.
Right. And it is in contrast to the US, which is number 2, and Japan, which is number 6. And could you share a little bit what you think about Japan now compared to what you thought about Japan 20 years ago?
Well, I think 25 years ago is a good comparison, because 25 years ago is when the stock market was still very high. 20 years ago was after the bubble economy.
That's true.
But 25 years ago, there was enormous confidence. Your growth was still, for developed countries, I think about 3%, was very respectable. And there was a certain confidence. Your companies were looking outwards, investing all over the region. I think to a certain extent there may have been some hyper-confidence. So you were buying things like Pebble Beach and Rockefeller Center.
Good old days.
Good old days. But it was an economy which was confident. You were generating new technologies, and you were moving causing the little geese to follow you in the economic development. You were the mother goose. And then Korea, Taiwan, Hong Kong, Singapore, these were the flying geese in the NIEs. But after the bubble economy burst, you had a very long period where you tried very hard to get the economy to stabilize and to grow again.
We call it lost 2 decades.
And the confidence to grow again. And it was a very difficult problem. And I think many countries didn't understand how challenging the conditions were for Japan. But eventually, Mr. Abe came back, and with his 3 arrows, I think he has succeeded in changing the mood and in getting the economy, although not growing very rapidly, but it is stabilized. And in terms of per capita income, your record is not bad, in fact, because per capita income on a national average basis is growing.
It's not declining.
No, it is growing per capita.
Yeah, a bit by bit.
But already from a very high level. If you live in Tokyo, you do not feel that there is a hardship because the shops are operating, the standard of living is high, people are courteous, and they have work. I think the difficulty for Japan is that your population is growing old, your workforce is working level population and workforce numbers are shrinking, and therefore the overall GDP number doesn't look like it is going up, but actually per capita it's okay, not worse than other countries. But there is a change in the mood in the country when that happens, and your towns, your villages, you find is depopulated, and in fact some of the villages are closing down.
Yes.
So that sets a different perspective on how optimistic you are and how you see the world.
So today, if there is something you can learn from Japan, is that possibly Japan's failures for the past 20, 30 years, or hard lessons that Japanese are learning for the past?
No, I think we learn from how you adapt to this aging of the society, because what's happening to you will happen to us, because our population growth, our procreation numbers, children, not enough children being born. And so our population is also aging, and we are maybe 15, 20 years behind you. Where you are now, 1 in 3 of your people are elderly.
That's right.
We are about 1 in 6 or 1 in 7. So in 15 years' time, we will be like you. And we are looking carefully at all the things you do, all the technology you invent, the devices for old folks, spoons and forks which old people can use, machines to give old people baths and shower.
That's very important.
All sorts of very clever devices which make life more pleasant and more practical for old people. And we need to learn, these are the things you invent, well, can we use them? What can we invent which we will need? That's one aspect. I think another aspect of aging is the companies, because it's not just what you sell, which you have to sell to old people, but also how you organize your company, your workforce. Many of your employees will be older people. So your companies have been very good at adjusting the jobs, the requirements, even the technology, so that old people can be productive and can keep on working. And I think we need to do a lot of that. But apart from the aging population, I think we also look at the way the Japanese people react when you have a crisis, when you have an earthquake, when you have a typhoon. We watched what happened after the Kobe earthquake, and people queued up in very orderly way for assistance, for food, for shelter. And again, after the Fukushima earthquake. So your ability to absorb natural disaster and for the society to stay together and have that cohesion is very impressive, and we need to learn.
I think Singaporeans have learned about that aspect of Japanese quite well for the past 50 years, I think.
We are still Kaizen, not arrived yet.
Well, I think probably these days Japanese are learning from Singaporeans about how cleanly people could make on the streets, and
I'm not sure. When I go to Tokyo, Tokyo is cleaner than Singapore.
Do you think so?
Yes.
Oh, okay.
Because when you smoke a cigarette, some Japanese people still smoke cigarette. They don't throw it on the floor. They carry it until they can find a dustbin. Singaporeans have not all learned that yet.
Oh, I didn't realize that. Okay. Well, thank you for a compliment. So looking at the businesses, what kind of business investments are you expecting these days, and how different they are today compared to 25 years ago?
Well, I think the technology level is much higher, and then also the investments are not just because of Singapore, but they are to do with your operations in the region. So like PCS, for example, Sumitomo, they are here not just because of their operations here, because in fact they sold the petrochemical plant already, but because they have operations throughout the region and the headquarters are here. They do research and development like Psycho. Or they may be, your financial institutions are here, but not just traditional banking. I think we are also having a lot of fintech activities here, so we hope that Japanese fintech companies will also come to Singapore. So it's manufacturing, it's services, it's regional operations. These are the activities for the future, and activities which can thrive in a country here where we don't have a lot of surplus workers, but we have skilled, disciplined employees, and where you can bring together employees from all over the region to work in your plant here. So if you set up a bank here, you can bring employees from China, from Korea, from Vietnam, from Indonesia, from India, from the West, and you can have 20, 30 nationalities in one place. I think in Tokyo you have a very big financial center, even bigger than us, but not so international in the orientation and in the composition of the people in the financial industries.
Language is a big barrier.
Language is a big consideration, yeah.
And Singapore has been very successful in adopting English as a national language.
It's our working language.
Yes.
So all the Japanese companies here speak English. Thank you. Arigato.
Yes, that's a major difference actually compared to other countries.
Yes, that is true. But at the same time, it makes us more open. So we are quicker to pick up trends from overseas. But when you have problems from overseas, they also can come here quicker.
Okay. Yeah.
And we don't have that insulation.
I'd like to talk a little bit about challenges that both Japan and Singapore are commonly sharing and facing. One of them is actually aging population and fewer kids. Actually, I heard the government is initiating kind of blind dates among younger people in Singapore. And what is your comprehensive strategy to cope with this?
Well, the government has been encouraging matchmaking amongst young people so as to improve their chances of finding a suitable partner.
Okay.
I don't know whether they do blind dates, but they used to do many activities. Nowadays, we have outsourced this. So we encourage it, but there are many private companies doing matchmaking,
yes.
Some online, some offline, some do blind dates, some do cruise to nowhere, some play games together, but I think they are playing a useful role.
And on more serious notes, we are aware as a Japanese that our birth rate went down because of the hardships that potential mothers have, especially working women, finding daycare centers and those conditions, and going back to job place they used to work in. So those problems have been identified as a major cause of lower birth rate. But how about in Singapore? What is your analysis of the cause?
Well, I think the fact that mothers are educated and wish to have their careers, and many of them are working, is a factor. Because they're not just staying at home, and if they're working, they'll have to assess the impact on their careers and whether they can manage to have children and work at the same time. Many mothers do, but some feel that I can well understand that this is not easy to achieve. So we have tried very hard to make it easier to be a mother in Singapore in terms of flexible employment practices, so that if you need time off or you need flexible hours, you have time to look after your kid. In terms of, we have worked very hard in terms of infant care and preschool child care, so that the mother can go back to work after the first couple of months and will not be trapped at home. We have also made sure that there's good schools and good employment opportunities. So when people look forward, they can see that there's a future for their kids. They can get educated, it's economical, and they can get jobs, and they have good opportunities ahead. We've also made sure that that people can have very affordable housing. So that, in fact, in Singapore, nearly everybody books and buys his public HDB flat before he sets up his home. It's the first thing they do as a couple. They register, then after they've registered, they go and book the flat, and then they may not live together until the flat is ready. Then they hold a wedding ceremony, pour tea, and then they move into the new home. Because they want to have their own home, they may not like to live with their parents. But that's fine. But we are able to provide, and I think that is an important reason why young people are able to have kids. I think our challenge is that 1/3 of young people don't marry very soon. So even until the mid-30s, maybe 1/3 are not married. And in our society, if you are not married, that also means you are very unlikely to have a child. Not like in Europe or America, where if you're not married, you often do so.
That's a French strategy, actually.
It's a French approach. Well, the French also, but the West, many countries are like that. We are not like that. And so only 2/3 get married by the mid-30s, and they have about 2 children each, but that's not enough.
That's right.
Because the people who didn't get married are not doing their share.
How are you factoring in the immigration policy in your demographics strategy?
They are an important flow. They are important both for the numbers and also because you bring in diversity and you bring in talent. Every year we have about 35,000 babies born who are Singaporean babies. And we have about 20,000 new citizens who are immigrants. And we have about 30,000 new people who get permanent residence in Singapore. So our own people, about 35,000, about an equal number come in as permanent residents, and out of those, mostly, maybe 20,000+ become citizens. So the inflow is not quite half, but a very significant inflow of the next generation.
So you're managing to keep the population growing?
The population is still growing slightly, but we think that by 4 or 5 years' time, it will level off, and it may later on, if the birth rates don't improve, it may later on start to decline.
Okay.
Yeah.
Oh, that's kind of counterintuitive to me. I mean, if you let immigrants keep coming in, you can probably keep your population growing.
No, but I've got 3.5 million citizens. If every citizen lives 80 years, I need 44,000 new babies a year. But I only have about 32,000. So I need 10,000 more babies.
So you cannot stop aging or...
Well, I mean, it depends on what the population trends are like, but I think what will happen is that the population will decline up to a point, and if I can maintain this number of this birth rate, then hopefully I will be able to stabilize. But best of all, if I can increase the birth rate, then the population can grow a little bit. That will be even better. Because we have so many plans for Singapore in terms of new industries, new businesses, new schools, new opportunities, new towns to live in, new parks, a new society to be built in the next generation. And what you need are new people, our children.
Okay. And one other aspect of maturing of an economy is, I believe most of people would agree that Singapore has completed its catch-up work with the advanced economies. Maybe it was already in 10 years ago, because Singapore already surpassed most of the countries in terms of GDP per capita. So what is the next goal or sense of aspiration for Singaporeans? And especially, you know, I interviewed your predecessor, Mr. Goh Chok Tong, in early 1990s, and he said one of the most important jobs for the government is goal setting and aspiration setting. And would you agree? And if you do, how are you setting a national goal or national sense of aspiration these days?
I think if you just look at it quantitatively per capita GDP, you may not get a full picture, because in the big countries like Japan, you're going on a national average. So it's not just Tokyo, but also Hokkaido, and not just Sapporo, but also very remote parts of the islands. In Singapore, we are only compared to Tokyo. And if we compare to Tokyo, I suspect Tokyo's per capita GDP is higher than ours. Certainly, New York, London would be higher than us. So, therefore, there's still room for us to grow. We will not grow very, very rapidly. We hope we can do 2-3% a year. But if we can sustain that, then there is a possibility for us to make a high quality of life in Singapore, not just for the top 10, 20, 30% of the population, but for the majority of the population in Singapore. And that includes, because today, 80% of our students complete secondary school and go on to post-secondary education. Okay. So they have technical education, or maybe polytechnic, or maybe university. But that's 80% of the population have that potential to hold skilled jobs and to have career progression and advancement and to learn new skills as they go along. And we want to make an economy where they can do that and a big chunk part of the population can look forward to that. Because if we look at the developed countries, the average may be high, but there's also a significant part of the population where they don't feel that they have the same opportunities as the top elite. And we don't want to be in that kind of a situation. We want to make sure that there are opportunities for everybody, including those who may not have done very well in school, to continue to improve themselves and their lives.
How is the situation of equality in Singapore right now? Is it worsening, or is it stabilizing?
If you compare with 20 years ago, I think it is probably somewhat less equal. If you compare to 10 years ago, I think it's about the same or even a little bit better. So there was a phase when the inequality widened around the time of the Asian financial crisis. After that, it stabilized, and with government measures like workfare, which is basically a negative income tax, and like ComCare, which is a social assistance to a lower income, and like with our housing schemes and our public health and so on, we have been able substantially to mitigate the inequality and, in fact, to improve things.
One thing I noticed when I was living in Singapore several years ago is very harsh education competition for the kids, especially when kids are like 10 years old. Because 10 years old exams kind of defined their lives going forward. And that's probably creating a kind of a sense of inequality among the people.
I think you put it too harshly. I would say it's keen competition, and the examination, which you'll talk about, the primary school leaving examination, is at 12 years old, and it doesn't determine their life. It does have a big influence on which secondary school they go into, because that's how we decide who can go into a secondary school. But whichever secondary school you go into, there are many pathways forward, and you can go on to university if you do well, or even if you don't do well, you can go on to Polytechnic or the ITE, and later on you can still go on and get a university degree. So it is not true that the PSLE determines your life.
Okay. I'm sorry.
No.
Maybe I was.
Maybe you are slightly out of date. We have improved,
okay.
And we are going to improve it a little bit more because we are changing the PSLE scoring system. Because up to now, up to this year, the scoring system is very precise. You compute every single mark, in fact, to 2 decimal places. and compute a kind of weighted average, and then you that determines your secondary school, and you compare it so precisely. But I don't think you can really measure people like that, because these are human beings, and it is not possible to say he is 101.12 and this one is 101.25. There's so many dimensions you have to compare. So we are going to redo the grading system to make it blunter, less finely discriminating, and I hope that parents and children will be less obsessed with pursuing that last half mark in the exam.
Okay.
But I think they are still very anxious. This year, the mathematics paper, there was one question which was a bit difficult, and some parents got very anxious about it.
I understand. Yeah, because I used to have a young kids many years ago, so
Yes.
although they're in college right now. Okay, let's move on to some global question. I think you would agree that the post-Cold War world order is changing dramatically, especially after Mr. Donald Trump became the president of the United States. And what's happening? Probably many people would agree that Mr. Trump is initiating kind of anti-multilateralism and anti-free trade, actually. And he unilaterally exited from the Trans-Pacific Partnership, for example. And meanwhile, there is Mr. Boris Johnson, who became Prime Minister of the UK, who is also declaring that he dared to conduct Brexit no matter what. So there's this big moment of anti-globalism here. And I think I have read somewhere that Mr. Ian Bremmer points out this is because there are many people who are being left behind, and harmed by the globalization and free trade, especially free trade and free immigration. And so the trend is against free trade in generally speaking. And I would like you to share how you're worried about these developments in this world.
We are concerned with the direction things are going. I'm not sure about the diagnosis that it is because globalization and free trade which have brought this about. Certainly, the changes in the trade patterns, China's engagement with the world and their very large increase in the exports to many countries has led to significant changes. But there are also major changes which are within each country, for example, from technological developments. So if we talk about coal mines, the coal mines have not been wiped out because the Chinese are exporting coal to America. Chinese are not exporting coal to America. But the Americans are fracking, producing natural gas, and that is what is making the coal mines uneconomic, and therefore the coal miners lose their jobs. So these are very powerful technological changes which are continuing. People don't fully understand them, but they feel the impact, and they blame it on something. So Mr. Trump doesn't say that he's against free trade. He says he's for free, fair, and reciprocal trade.
Okay.
But what exactly that means, well, that depends on how his trade negotiator carries out their mandate, and they make many requests of their counterparts. They're negotiating with China, but they also have been negotiating with Japan. So the result of this is that we are going to have uncertainty in the global trading system. I think global trade has already slowed down. The global economies are also slowing down. And it is not good in the long term, because if we don't have that free trade and we divide up into your world and my world, your technology and my technology, then it could be your block and my block. And I have my friends and you have my friends, and I may or may not be your friend. And I think it's a very unstable world, an unhappy world. So while America has this position that Mr. Trump says globalism, he doesn't believe in that. He says put your own country first. And there's some of that sentiment elsewhere too. I think other countries need to work together to continue to do multilateral cooperation, like in the CPTPP, which Mr. Abe has taken a lead role in making it happen. And we hope we can do other groups as well, like the RCEP in Asia, or like between Singapore and Europe, we're having EU-Singapore FTA. And I've just come back from Armenia, where we signed the Singapore-Eurasian Union FTA with Russia and its group of countries, Kazakhstan, Armenia, Kyrgyzstan, Belarus. So I think a network of these arrangements, we hope will be able to hold a position until the global mood changes.
Are you still optimistic about RCEP, RCEP, and do you think Japan and Singapore together have some role to play to advance?
Yes. We are still working hard at the RCEP. It has taken quite some time. I think that we hope that we will be able to reach the finish line. I believe that there has been progress being made. We have not got there yet, but I hope we will get there. And Japan has a very important role to play, because Japan, this is a group which does not coincide with the CPTPP. And Japan is a big participant in the RCEP. And if you lean forward to make it happen, there would be a strong incentive for other countries to participate and to join in too.
Some countries, especially I think India, is strongly skeptical about the current proposal about RCEP.
They have expressed their concerns. India's perspective is that they are worried about their goods, their balance of payments, balance of trade, goods. And particularly, they are worried about their competitiveness compared to China.
Right.
Because China has a big trade surplus with them. In fact, the Indian elephant god, the Ganesha, all the Ganeshas are made in China.
I didn't know that.
Yes. So they are very worried that if there's a free trade agreement, maybe more things will come from China and they will not be competitive. So they have to work out between them what are the safeguards and how to phase it in. But the Indians want the services part. They think they have strengths and they would like to export services. And this is something which is actively being discussed now.
I recall Singapore used to have a large trade deficit against Japan. In 80s especially, and probably 90s as well. But you moved to have free trade agreement, EPA, with Japan in early 2000s, despite you have a very big deficit. So it proves that free trade actually develops your industry and makes things
Yes, absolutely. Our view is the orthodox economist's view, which is that the bilateral surplus or deficit is meaningless. The global surplus or deficit means something, but it does not mean whether you should have free trade or not. It means that your macroeconomic balance is not fully in balance for some reason. Your savings could be higher than your investment, then you have a trade surplus, your savings less than your investment, or your consumption is less than your production, then you have a trade deficit. So it reflects macroeconomic factors. And if you have a problem with a trade deficit, you have to address those macroeconomic factors. Not having a trade agreement does not help you solve a trade deficit, especially a bilateral one. But I think Mr. Trump has a different view.
Right.
No, he just has a different perspective. He does not accept this.
If he has any perspective at all, actually.
No, I think he does have a view on trade, and he has taken this view for a very long time, since long before he became president.
That's true. But do you think the current tension between the United States and China is about trade? I think it's more about political power or political hegemony.
I think there are different elements in it. It has developed because China today is so much bigger and significant in the global economy than it was 20 years ago when it joined the WTO, 2001. But the unhappiness in America, Mr. Trump's starting unhappiness was the bilateral trade deficit. That's what he focused on.
Yeah.
But now he's broadened beyond that. His trade negotiators, his commerce secretary, they are talking about intellectual property, they are talking about technology transfers, forced technology transfers, all sorts of trade-related issues. So on the trade front, it is not just trade, the SOEs as well. But actually, there are also other people in the administration and other people in America as well who see this as not just trade and see this as a tussle for dominance. And that is it wise for America to cooperate with China when China is growing stronger and may one day very likely become bigger than America. And I think that is and therefore, some of them hope to use this trade issue as a way to slow down China's growth and to hold back China. And I don't think they will succeed, and I don't think that is wise.
You just came back from the United States, and you took a couple of interviews, actually, with American media.
Yes.
And you said a very interesting thing, I think, in a Washington Post interview, that, China also has to pay their share of responsibility.
Yes.
And could you elaborate what kind of responsibility maybe China should take these days? I mean, China is different from 25 years ago.
Yeah. Well, for example, on trade, to start off with, when they entered the WTO in 2001, their trade was maybe 4% of the world trade. Now they're about 13% of the world trade, 14 or more. And so the concessions which countries made to them in 2001 today become no longer politically sustainable because the impact is so much greater. And frankly, China is so much more developed today. Their GDP has gone up 3-4 times since 2001.
Okay.
That what they needed, because they were backward in 2001, is no longer appropriate for them today in their more developed status. And therefore, it is necessary to recalibrate the terms on which they are engaging into the global economy. And that means things like intellectual property, that means protection for the markets, that means the rules which they are able to abide by and commit to. And these are adjustments which have to be made by China, partly in order to maintain sound relations with other economies, but partly because it is in their own interest as they develop to adjust policies to their status of development. And I think they have done some, but I don't think that they have done enough.
Does that include the political system or political institutions?
I think the political system is a different thing. It's very difficult to tell another country you have to change your political system because you are a developed economy. I think each country must decide what is its own best political system. I think for us, for example, to tell the Americans that their political system is good or is no good would be very, very presumptuous of us. And similarly, if we were to tell the Chinese that political system is good or no good, it's not possible. We cannot take responsibility for any recommendations which we make to them.
Are you watching Hong Kong situation?
Yes, we read the newspapers.
Are you worried?
Yes, we are worried.
What is the worst case scenario?
Well, I think it is a very grave situation which they are in because there is a very deep split in the society, in the attitudes. There is deep unhappiness. Unhappiness partly because they are part of China. It's one country, two systems. And some of the Hong Kongers wish that they were just two. So that's one element of it. The other element of it, another element of it is because the Chinese economy's influence on Hong Kong is so pervasive. And they used to be the successful and more advanced ones, and the Chinese used to be the less prosperous ones, and the poorer cousins. Now the poorer cousins are not poor anymore. And there are many, and they come, and when they come as tourists, they are very visible, so that Hong Kongers have a reaction to that. I think a third one is domestically within Hong Kong. They want to have the government reflect their interests and their concerns more. And they do have some very difficult issues to resolve, social issues like housing, issues of jobs, issues of medical care, education. And these are very fundamental things where Hong Kong, I think they feel under great stress. And as a result, it has all come together in these demonstrations. It
Does
was
it have
triggered by the extradition legislation, but I think they are not interested in the extradition legislation anymore. That's dead.
That's right. Does the situation have any implication to Singapore?
It's bad for us. I mean, it's much, much better for us that Hong Kong is prospering, stable. We cooperate with them, we will compete with them, and they will do business, and we will do business with them and with China. This way, the instability affects the whole region. The lack of confidence will infect the rest of the region as well.
Okay, thank you very much. We are about to run out of time, but we have still a couple of minutes, so I'd like to take a couple of questions from the floor. If you have any questions, could you raise your hand? Okay, I see a gentleman sitting on the second floor. Could you give him a microphone here? Please introduce yourself and pose a question to Prime Minister.
Good afternoon, Prime Minister Lee. I'm Kaoru Furuya of SMBC. I'd like to learn Singapore's strategy for further development of startup segment, and also Singapore's expectations on how Japanese companies can be part of such development.
We would like to develop our startups industries. We see it as an important element in the economy. It may not be a big percentage of the GDP, but it generates vibrance, new ideas, and the potential for new companies to emerge. And if you are very lucky and very shrewd, you may produce one unicorn once in a while. And so what we are trying to do is to create an environment where it's easy for people to start companies, where people would like to start companies, and where if you start a company, you have all of the support you need, the angel investors, the venture funds, the infrastructure, the incubators, as well as the possibility of taking a company big and either selling it to an established operation or maybe taking it all the way. We've made some progress. We have an incubator called Block 71 in Singapore, where there are quite a number of startups. And our strategy is not just startups which are by Singaporeans, but startups in Singapore, and many of them are by foreigners from the region who come to Singapore, and they have started up companies in Singapore. And some of them have some of the companies are not quite startup anymore, but Gojek and Go, for example, they were startups from Indonesia, from Malaysia. They have come to Singapore. They're operating in Singapore, and we are happy that it is this way. So we hope that more such companies will come, and that is not just that we'll have startups across a whole range, those which are on e-services, at the same time those which have technical content. And also an important area is fintech, where we have quite a vibrant scene, and every year we have a fintech festival, and they tell me 100,000 people come to the fintech festival. It's a very big scale. So we hope that in time that will produce many fruits.
Okay. I actually did a story about those startups founded by foreigners in Singapore, and doing very good. So I think you guys are doing very, very successfully in this regard.
So we hope that many Japanese companies will hear about this and come to Singapore and take advantage of the opportunities here.
Okay, great. In that happy note, I think we just ran out of time, so we must conclude this conversation. But please join me in thanking Prime Minister Lee for insightful remarks for this conversation. Thank you very much.